I also have with me right now Professor Greg Barton. He is a research professor and chair of Global Islamic Politics at Deakin University. My first question to you about India that has sent its envoys to 33 countries to stitch a coalition against terrorism and the states backing terrorism. How do you view these efforts?
Well, India and the situation with Pakistan, it's a unique situation. Terrorism, we generally think of it as being non-state actors, but unfortunately sometimes states get into the habit of relying on non-state actors to do their dirty work and think that they can control extremist groups. That's generally a mistake. Historically, I think it's been a mistake for Pakistan to think it can control groups. So one of the challenges now is putting the maximum incentive on Pakistan to control groups that perhaps in the past it felt that it had some authority over. Whether or not they have the direct control now is an open question, but the important thing is the result, that they rein in these groups and that they limit their capacity to recruit and to operate. Because it's, this is a tragedy for India, but it's also a major problem for Pakistan, which is now grappling with, in recent years, rising levels of terrorism when just a few years ago, levels of terrorism in Pakistan were going down. So I think it is important to find points where we can come together and say terrorism is a threat to all countries, in this case to two neighbours. And this is as much about solving a problem for Pakistan as it is about trying to remove the threat to India.
2002 Bali bombing mastermind was extradited from Pakistan. Osama bin Laden was in Pakistan. The London bomber was also located in Pakistan. Why is the world reluctant in demanding accountability from the country for funding terror?
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, there's a lot of lessons to be learned. And when you speak about the Bali bombing and the problems across Indonesia and Southeast Asia, what we're talking about in particular is Afghanistan. So, tragically, after 20 years of military conflict in Afghanistan, the same group that bears culpability for Afghanistan, now the Taliban is back in charge. And that's a problem. From the point of view of India's security concerns, if Pakistan was a very strong, stable state now able to secure its borders, Afghanistan would be less of a threat. But because Pakistan is struggling, it's not just the issues with Pakistan per se, but it's the threat, I think a rising threat posed by what's happening in Afghanistan, where both Islamic State and Al-Qaeda groups have a clear base that's not controlled, and people from across South Asia, but also Southeast Asia and beyond can move in and train, and that has long-term potential as a threat. The question as to why Pakistan has not been brought to account more over the years, I think it's complex. Part of it was the dynamics of the Cold War. Part of it was, I think, mistaken calculations. America relied heavily on Pakistan to control these elements. I think they misread the level of control that Pakistan had. They also misread perhaps some of the intention. We can't undo the past, but of course what we're concerned is, as far as we possibly can, to determine that nothing like the tragedy in which 26 lives were lost in Kashmir happens again, and that all of the circumstances that facilitated a group being able to launch an attack like that are dealt with. And some of that is directly in Pakistan's control. Some of it Pakistan has to build its own capacity because it's clearly struggling with terrorist groups.
If a country's defense minister accepts that he's harboring terrorists in his country, and if there are army officials attending state funerals of terrorists, how would you define such a state?
Such a situation is a state that is struggling, in some respects is failing. And I think one of the lessons, trying to be objective about this, one of the lessons we can learn from Pakistan's experience is that playing with fire not only sees you getting burnt, but risks your house being burnt down. If you play with extremist groups and think you can control them, and some elements clearly of ISI and Pakistan military intelligence over the decades have felt they could control groups like Lashkar-e-Toiba, for example. I think that's a grave mistake. It's not only a moral mistake, but it's a strategic mistake because those groups have their own agendas. And the reality at the moment is that Pakistan is struggling with a spate of terror attacks clearly across the border. No one wins from terrorist groups on the rise. So the reality is Pakistan is a struggling state. I hope it's not a failing state, but it's certainly struggling. And that's sad for the people of Pakistan, but it's also a threat to India, clearly.
If the Lashkar-e-Toiba chief Hafiz Saeed and Jaish-e-Mohammed chief Masood Azhar are publicly spotted giving speeches in Pakistan, do you support India's right to strike their terror camps in retaliation?
Look, India has a right and an obligation to defend itself. I think when we talk about what we want to achieve is greater security and long-term stable security. So there is in the political domain a desire to try and be seen to be strong and have an immediate victory. That's understandable, that's legitimate, but we also need to think about the longer term strategic implications. So from India's point of view, I would suggest it's really important that those elements in the Pakistani state, those elements of the Pakistani military, but also the civilian government, who understand these problems and are prepared to deal with them, that we strengthen the arms of those more moderate elements, and that we, by all means, I think India has to be critical of those that are failing. But let's not mistake political victories that might appeal to a domestic audience and think that that's solved the security problem, because security problems are bigger than politics. So I fully understand politicians need to do what they do, but let's not let their agenda risk making the right strategic decisions. And I'm thinking about the longer term consequences and lessons of the region. When America went into Afghanistan in late 2001, we understand why it went there after the 9/11 attacks. But the tragic mistake was they never had a clear strategic vision, they and their allies, including my country, Australia, and Europe, that joined them. We could understand why they wanted to fight the Taliban, why they wanted to fight Al-Qaeda, but unfortunately they failed. And they failed partly because the politics got in the way of clear, objective strategic thinking. There was never a clear military strategy that was allowed to prevail in the case of Afghanistan. The same mistake in different ways was repeated in Iraq. So I think we need to learn the lessons of the last few decades. If we think that just leaving this to the back and forth of politics is going to make us safer, I think that's a serious risk.
How should the democratic world act against countries like Pakistan that fund and harbor terrorists?
I think we need to call out this behavior of playing with fire, of harboring terrorism. We need to point out that it threatens not just neighboring states. India is threatened by what Pakistan is doing, but it threatens Pakistan. And that for the benefit of everyone, we need to break this cycle of behavior. There were reasons that it developed in the past. There is no good reason at the moment, there never was a good reason, but there's certainly no good reason at the moment for the Pakistan state to harbor terrorists. The bitter experience of the last 3 decades is you can't control such extremist elements. As I said, you risk being burnt, or even worse, your house being burnt down when you play with fire. And so I think we need to call that out calmly and politely and say this is not good for everyone. We need to find solutions. So just publicly shaming isn't enough to bring about the change in behavior we're looking for. We need to work together to find solutions, because this is a threat to everyone.
Why do you think the United Nations continues to be reluctant on defining terrorism?
Yeah, the United Nations is one of these international bodies, unique international body that, I think we're all glad that it exists and it works as well as it does, but we're all dissatisfied with the fact that it doesn't work as well as it needs to work. And in areas like this, it can be just too slow and too bureaucratic. So we absolutely need to get the United Nations involved in these sort of issues. We need to find pathways to leverage what the United Nations can uniquely do. But unfortunately, we can't rely on a UN solution to these problems. These problems have to be handled in partnership, bilateral partnerships with other democratic states and long-term partners and allies, but also regionally.
How do we make the FATF responses against terror funding states stronger?
We have mechanisms in place to deal with terrorism funding, and I think one of the things that we need to do is bring out evidence and make the case very clearly. When we can have evidence of financial flows, point it out and make it more difficult for those who would somehow defend this to cover it up. And I think that the baseline in all of this is that it's no good for anyone to play with extremist forces, to sponsor terrorists. They might think that they're controlling a group that's useful, that gives them some benefit, but this is not good for Pakistan, just as much as it's a threat for India. And I think we need to recognise that even though Pakistan is a failing state, its democracy is weak, it still is a democracy, so there are mechanisms of accountability, there's questions of public opinion and press, and we need to work in a wise way to strengthen the arms of moderate forces in Pakistan so that they can be part of the solution. Clearly, this is not something the people of Pakistan are wishing for, and clearly there are many leaders in Pakistan who understand the problem. We just need to find a way of working with them so we get the best results as quickly as we can, because there's an ongoing threat. There's an ongoing threat from escalation. Thankfully, the exchanges after the 26 lives lost to terror attacks, that process of exchange, for the time being, that cycle has closed, but it could flare up at any time because these issues have not yet been addressed. So that's a major level of threat. But also we could have other terror attacks. It only takes a couple of charismatic individuals to persuade some gullible young men to go ahead and do something which they claim is going to make them heroes for an attack to occur. So it's, unfortunately, this is a universal challenge we've come to understand. We need to work together to try and bring all the forces we can to deal with this as quickly as possible, because there's a real risk at the moment that we could see further attacks and we can see further military escalations in a way that could have really tragic unintended consequences.
Do you think China and Turkey supporting terror funding states like Pakistan unconditionally is a cause of global concern?
It's certainly a cause of concern. What we know is that both Turkey and China have their own terror concerns, and they speak regularly about this. And yet at the same time, their behavior, and it needs to be said that China is not unique in doing this, America and its Western democratic allies make the same mistakes in different domains, that we say our principles are one thing, but in practice, for expediency or for whatever reason, we don't always consistently act on those principles. So what we need to be saying to China and to Turkey is, you are important nations, you face your own threats from terrorism. We work as a community of nations together to manage this threat. So please, you have unique leverage over Pakistan. You have special relationship, which is understandable. Use that in a way which is good for Pakistan and for yourselves and for all of us. We need your leadership. But I think framing it in terms of Chinese leadership is a more positive avenue, rather than just scolding people and saying you're disappointing us because you're not doing the right thing. That may be true, but we're looking at results. This is more than just politics.